Hello and thank you for joining us on Newsweek, where we highlight some of the biggest stories that made the headlines recently. I am Jacinta Agochukwu. This week, President Bola Tinubu took decisive action to address the pressing issue of food inflation by declaring a state of emergency, recognizing the urgent need to alleviate the hardship faced by citizens. He ordered the immediate release of fertilizers and grains, aiming to stabilize food prices and ensure adequate supply. Also this week, the House of Representatives approved President Tinubu's request for subsidy palliatives, acknowledging the need for measures to mitigate the economic burden on the Nigerian people. Later on the show, private security intercepts 8,000-liter capacity vessel with stolen crude oil. All the details in a moment. Stay with us. President Bola Tinubu during the week declared a state of emergency on food security as the federal government stepped up efforts to tackle food inflation following the removal of fuel subsidy. Tinubu also approved that all matters pertaining to food and water availability and affordability be included within the preview of the National Security Council. There would also be immediate release of fertilizers and grains to farmers and households to mitigate the effects of the subsidy removal. Also, a commodity board would be created to monitor and control food prices. Special advisor to the President on Special Duties, Communication and Strategy, Dele Alake, disclosed this to a State House correspondent. Alake said the administration intends to deploy some savings from the fuel subsidy removal into the agricultural sector, focusing on revamping the agricultural sector. Alake explained that FG would partner with states to create ranches in those whose government are willing to provide lands. Joining me to discuss this in the studio, I have Ayodele Adio, and he is a policy analyst. And as well, I have Olufemi Lawson, Executive Director, Center for Public Accountability via Zoom, joining me. Good evening, gentlemen. Mr. Ayodele, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Let me begin with you, Mr. Olufemi Lawson. What do you make of this intervention by President Tinubu? Some say it's long overdue, as the food crisis in the country has persisted for a long time.
Thank you for having me. It's a very right step, very timely, especially when you look at the fact that as we speak, not less than 25 million of our population are facing extreme hunger. As we speak, the consequences of last year's, flooding witnessed across the country, which is perhaps the worst in the last 10 years, still lingers. So something very radical has to be done. And I think that is what President Tinubu has done. Unfortunately, Nigerians had expected that this would have been done almost immediately after, last year's flood, which practically, led to the total, calamity on the agricultural sector, over 675, hectares in some communities, in other communities, hectares of land in thousands got swept away by the flood. So the implications are already here. The consequences are already around here. In actual fact, in the last couple of weeks, it has practically become impossible for Nigerians to even go to the market with their own money and get some of these food items for purchase. During the last Salah celebration, people could practically purchase, pepper and tomato, even to cook, even with their money. So the consequences of this demand such radical actions as taken by the president, and I think it's commendable. Not only is it commendable that, of course, a relief will come to the challenges we're currently facing, I think it's also a very fundamental step in our quest as a country to improve and increase agricultural potentials, because this will not only be an encouragement for existing farmers, it will not be an encouragement for people who are already in the business, but this will also be an encouragement for people who are willing to go into the farming business. So It's a radical decision, and I think it's long, overdue.
All right, let me come to you, Mr. Ayodele. You will agree with me that Nigeria is actually blessed with millions of hectares of arable land which have not been optimally utilized. How do you think that food sufficiency can be achieved?
I mean, a lot of work and planning has to go into this. Like your guest has rightfully mentioned, there are key drivers that has worsened the cost of food in our country today. And mind you, you recall that the major instigator of inflation in our country today are the prices of food items, because the average household expends over 65% of its income on food alone, and so when the prices of food goes up, it inadvertently triggers inflation across the country. And if you deal with the prices of food and you bring it down, it would have a positive effect on inflation, which means to drop inflation much lower. But of course, there are challenges, one of which is the flooding that happens across the country. How do we deal with that? And how is that situated in the plan of the president? Of course, another problem is infrastructure. How do we connect places where food are being produced to the market? That's a critical problem that we have to deal with, which means in the plan there has to be quality spending on infrastructure. Of course, there is the fact of insecurity. A lot of farmers are afraid to go to farmlands in certain places in the country. How do we make farmers feel safer to go to farms? So these are the issues that have to be properly situated in Mr. President's plan if we're going to see any positive impact from what has been carefully articulated. Now, if there is no proper planning, like we saw with many of the policies, especially as driven by the CBN in the last 3 years, and I'm talking about the Anchors Borrowers programs and several other programs, that was in partnership with the CBN and the Ministry of Agriculture, that spectacularly failed because there was poor coordination and there was a lack of cohesion between the federal government and what was happening across states. So one of the things that I would like to see is that there is better coordination between the plans and policies of the federal government with the 36 Ministry of Agriculture across the 36 states, because the subnational governments are where land is. You need governors to access land. So if you're planning without these governors, I think those plans will end up in futility. So I would like to see a lot more cohesion, a lot more coordination between the federal government and the state governments, and map out a clear plan, and scrutiny to see that this plan are carefully implemented. And then we may begin to see the benefits of this. But I like the fact that the president has identified that there's a food crisis. And if we don't drop the prices of food and commodities in our country, we'll continue to struggle with inflation. Because for the last 24 months, we have tried to deal with this inflation by raising rates in terms of monetary policy. And we've continued to raise rates, and inflation has continued to go up. So it clearly shows that the problem is not too much money in circulation. The real problem here is the cost of food. And if we don't attack that, inflation will continue to elude us and continue to dwindle our purchasing power across the country.
All right, Mr. Olufemi Lawson, just like Ayodele had mentioned, of course, there are a combination of several factors that had conspired to deprive many homes of food. And he also made some suggestion on how this plan should work out. To you, how do you think this plan by the president can be well implemented?
Well, most importantly, the president must ensure that this is not another, food for the boys. Just like he said, over the past 2 years, we've had a situation whereby this country, gave money in billions of nairas to farmers whose farms only existed in their briefcases and, of course, in their offices in Abuja and some other states across the country, who never planted a seed anywhere in this country. And that is why today, despite all the huge amount of money given out by the CBN in the name of anchor borrower and all sort of funny nomenclatures, there's no single bag of rice that can be shown as a result of such investment in the agricultural sector. Secondly, the president, before releasing these funds that are going to be meant to support this national emergency declaration on food security, must do the needful by ensuring that we prepare the necessary grants for people to be able to return from farm, for investors to be able to come into the agricultural sector. Today, the question of insecurity, in a lot of states today, Plateau, Benue, other states in the Middle Belt, which are the food basket of these nations, farmers can no longer go to farm. In some places, herders also have issues with security of their cattle and herders. Today, as we speak, there are communities that are going to be flooded this year, according to the NIMET prediction. So the federal government must look at these critical issues, address it before moving in the direction of providing the needed resources to address this issue of food security as declared by the state of emergency of food security. Otherwise, this will end up as another palliative for the boys, many of whom will not leave Abuja, but take money in the name of implementing the federal government emergency on food security. So the federal government, most importantly President Bola Tinubu, must define its approach towards ensuring the implementation of this national emergency on food security. We must address the question of insecurity. We must be able to ensure that our farmers are able to go back to the farm. We must ensure that the needed climatic issues are addressed. The issue of climate change, we cannot overrule it. We cannot talk about food security without talking about the challenges of climate change. So these are fundamental issues that the government must look into before rolling out whatever.
We need to go on break. All right, gentlemen, let's take a short time out, and when we come back, Newsweek continues in a moment. Stay with us. Welcome back, and if you're just tuning in, it's Newsweek, where we highlight some of the biggest stories that made the headlines recently. Now, on Thursday, the House of Representatives, the plenary approved President Bola Ahmed Tinubu's request for 500 billion naira for fuel subsidy palliative. The president had on Wednesday requested the House passage of the 500 billion naira from the supplementary budget for subsidy palliatives. However, the Nigeria Labour Congress and the Trade Union Congress criticized this move, stating that it is grossly inadequate to assuage the hardship confronting workers sequel to the fuel subsidy removal. They are demanding a 300% salary increase to enable workers to cope with the challenges imposed by the deteriorating economy situation that came with the removal of the controversial fuel subsidy. I still have Olufemi Lawson, Executive Director, Center for Public Accountability via Zoom, and Ayodele Adio, a policy analyst in the studio with me. And let me come to you. Many have argued that this palliative is actually not is not going to adequately address the hardship Nigerians are faced with, and as well that the 8,000 monthly pay or something is not going to be sustainable. What do you think?
Now, this is very interesting because the problem that confronts us is across social strata. That means the extremely poor people have a challenge. Middle-class Nigerians or working-class Nigerians also have a challenge. And so you need policies that target Nigerians in their generality and not a section, of the Nigerian people. And so I'll start by looking at the pros of a conditional cash transfer policy to the poorest of the country. It's worked before in certain countries in the world, like in Brazil, where I believe that this policy is being copied from. But what they did was that they had a clear centralized register of every single citizen that was benefiting from that policy. And they could track whoever was receiving a dime, from the federal government. And those palliatives were tied to specific outcomes. And it was conditioned upon the beneficiaries to do a part of sending their children to school and for immunizing their kids, right? So it was easy to track. The problem we have here is that this same program, in fact, was the crust of the Buhari administration. It was the ministry that had the highest allocation in the last 8 years. And what happened? Poverty increased in that same period, and unemployment increased in that same period. So it shows that that exercise was merely palliative for the boys, and it was not clearly targeted because it was not data-driven or there were no needs assessment. And so to that extent, you can understand the criticism towards this. particular policy program, especially given the fact that it barely scratches the surface of what we are confronted with as a country. And like the NLC have said, the purchasing power of the average Nigerian has drastically dwindled, many of whom will not be captured in this 8,000 naira monthly palliative that will be disbursed by the president. So what sort of palliative is going to come to this section of Nigerians? And that is the crux of the matter. Because if we continue to allow a situation where workers can no longer make it to work, workers do not longer have purchasing power, living conditions have continued to envelop them, and they continue to fall into the poverty class, then we're edging towards a bit of chaos. So we would like to see a plan that addresses holistically the challenges that people face as a country. And in my own opinion, beyond a 500 billion palliative that will go to the poor, and there's criticisms to that to show that it's well coordinated. We want to see a plan that keeps businesses open. There has to be a targeted incentive or a targeted intervention to businesses, SMEs across the country. And these disbursements have to go to microfinance institutions where many people of these businesses access commercial loans from, which are over 60% as I speak to you today, making it impossible for small businesses to access funding. If these businesses close shop, poverty will worsen, unemployment will worsen. So there has to be a targeted intervention to keep small businesses open. And there has to be a step forward for interventions, I would argue, for 6 major industrialized interventions across the 6 geopolitical zones. For instance, we have no business, any government parastatal in this country, buying Toyota cars when there is an indigenous company producing cars somewhere in the southeast. I want to see an audacious investment like it was done by Italy with Fiat Motors right after the Second World War, where a single company revived the economy of Italy. I want to see a huge investment going to a place like Innocent Motors to drive urban productivity, which you want to see clusters setting up. People who are making glasses will set up companies. People who are making leather in the north, it could revive an industry. Things like that need to happen to galvanize our economy and not merely palliatives. Right. And if these things are not done, we'll find ourselves in a very serious problem, worse than we are before we even came into this.
All right, Olufemi, let me come to you. What do you think? Do you think the demand for a 300% pay raise by NLC and TUC is realistic and justified?
Well, it is within the right of the Labour Congress or every workers' union to demand for increase in wages. It's a global practice. It is statutorily, a practice that is guaranteed. But I think the fate of our nation cannot be determined by the aspiration of the workers alone, especially when you have a country where a very huge population, over 130 million, lives in extreme poverty. So we may not be able to use, the expectations of the labor movement to determine, our priority as a nation. It is good for the labor movement to demand an increase, be it 500%, 200%, or 100%. But the government must be realistic in its approach. In its approach to the extent that we must only consider the interest of the vast majority. We must always consider the interest of the downtrodden, the people at the bottom of the ladder. Because as we speak, it has become so difficult for the people at that category of citizens to even feed once in a day, not less of twice. So while we are seeking increments in wages on the basis of approval of funds by the National Assembly for the presidency, just like Mr. Adek, I as a person I'm clearly and fundamentally opposed to distribution of 8,000 naira for each household. It's an experiment that has failed for over how many years? For over 4 years, the Buhari government was busy distributing money without data, all over the market. The ministry was dedicated for humanitarian purposes and charity, and nothing came out of it. Wasted national resources, no accountability, no record or whatsoever. So I am not.
Mr. Olufemi, we're almost out of time. We still have one more story to talk about before our time goes. Let's move to our final story for tonight. A vessel conveying 800,000 liters of suspected stolen crude oil has been intercepted by a private security contractor engaged by the Nigerian National Petroleum Company Limited. The vessel and its crew members were apprehended on July 7th at an offshore location heading to Cameroon. Gaba Mohammed, Chief of Cooperative Communication Officer, NNPCL, said this in a statement on Monday in Abuja. According to him, preliminary investigation revealed that the crude oil cargo on board was illegally sourced from a well jacket offshore in Ondo State, Nigeria. Further investigation into the activities of the vessel at the NNPC Limited Command and Control Center also revealed that the vessel has been operating in stealth mode for the last 12 years. As you have Olufemi and Ayodele with me. Ayodele, you know, oil smuggling is one of the many issues Nigeria is faced with. How do you think Bola Ahmed Tinubu can, should really handle this permanently?
I wish I had the right answers for him. It's been a problem for many, many years, and there's a lot of corruption across the value chain. And I'm not sure how we can effectively deal with this, because now we're outsourcing it to private contractors, some of whom are even non-state actors. I have my views as to why a country shouldn't engage non-state actors in terms of critical infrastructure of the country and talking about our national wealth. But it would seem that we lack, capacity within our security apparatus, and that's why previous administration have often outsourced that to some non-state actors. But for me, I always believe that when there's a will, there's a way. We're losing billions and billions of dollars, especially our country that is begging for resources now that we're suffering a revenue crisis. We're losing billions of dollars from stolen crude. That alone should signal some sort, of urgency, from the President, from the National Security Council, to ensure that our stolen crude, that they eliminate stolen crude in our country. We have all the intelligence agencies to draw inspiration from, to put some sort of a grandiose plan together and nip this in the bud. But what I see is that there's the lack of will to see this through to a very logical conclusion. And except there is that will, I'm afraid that we're just going to be running in circles, because there's no reason why, a private security is intercepting this. And, our own security agencies have failed to do this over the years. And we'll have to see more of these. I would like to see many of these vessels sunk immediately.
I was going to put the fact that, it was actually the collaboration of our security personnel that this was achieved. But we are almost out of time. Let me get the view of Lawson. Lawson, let's talk about the cabals behind this oil theft operation. How can these cabals be caught and prosecuted?
You see, I'm not in any way carried away by the dramatization of the arrest of that vessel. It's a further demonstration of the failure of our national security institution. And we must stop celebrating such drama. Moving forward, I think Nigeria must prioritize the security of our national critical infrastructures, especially such that is the mainstay of our economy. I think it is unheard that we have to rely on militant or ex-militant or non-state actors to protect national security infrastructures like crude oil pipeline and jackets and the likes. Moving forward, the president this time around must take seriously the role of our national security institutions, particularly those that are meant to protect these critical infrastructures, like the oil pipeline and the various infrastructures where crude oil is stolen, because arresting vessels and destroying them also have its own implications. Who is thinking about the pollution of our waters when you have to go and sink a vessel that has a capacity for about 1 million barrels of liters of crude oil? So these are fundamental issues that we must interrogate. So beyond the dramatization, we must take this seriously, and the president must take decisive steps at empowering our national security to ensure that they are able to tackle this menace of oil theft in the country.
All right, gentlemen, thank you very much. I've been speaking with Olufemi Lawson, Executive Director, Center for Public Accountability, and Ayodele Adio, a policy analyst. Thank you, gentlemen, for coming on the show.
Thank you.
As well, thank you for being part of the show. Remember, you can follow the conversation on our social media platform at TVC News NG and or our website at tvcnews.tv. I am Jacinta Agochukwu. And until next week, it's goodbye.